In the CMMC ecosystem, you hear a lot about contract officers and their potential role in requiring CMMC in the award of new contracts, but you don't often hear from their perspective. Well, today we get the chance to do just that. I'm excited to sit down with Kevin Jans, a former contract officer and currently the founder and CEO of Skyway Acquisitions. They are a consulting organization that is made up of former contract officers with the goal of bridging the gap between contractors and your government buyers so that both sides can do GovCon more efficiently. Now, in this episode, we discuss the actual role of the contract officer relative to requiring CMMC type of clauses, how many bids contract officers actually need to procure and award new contracts, and the huge competitive advantage CMMC certification can have for your organization if you get ahead of these requirements. So without further ado, please enjoy this insightful conversation with Kevin Jans on this episode of Mostly Compliant. Kevin Jans, thank you so much for joining us on the Mostly Compliant podcast. I am very excited to talk to you today. As I've kind of outlined in the intro, we're excited to get CMMC from a contract officer or former contract officer's perspective. And so I think that would be a really good place to start. Kevin, do you mind tell the audience a little bit more about you, your background as a contract officer, and then how that segued into the work that you guys do as Skyway Acquisitions now?
Sure. So I was a contracting officer for the first half of my career, I guess. I worked for the Air Force and also at the Special Operations Command in Tampa, Florida. And there were a lot of contractors that I worked with. They seemed to be missing some of the stuff that was really obvious to me as a contracting officer, how things were done, the rules that we had, those kind of things. And I thought, well, wow, if somebody can help them understand what the government is thinking, I think government contracting can be more efficient. Well, this is in 2011, right? And then I realized, well, wait a minute, what if the opposite is true? What if there's all kinds of stuff that I, as a contracting officer, have no idea of how things work on the contractor side, which of course that is true, right? And so that's the premise of Skyway. And so the picture behind me, that's the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. And MacDill Air Force Base was my last job as a contracting officer. So I named it after the Skyway Bridge because I want it to be a bridge between both sides. That's the premise, is if you understand how both sides work, you'll be more effective in government contracting. And frankly, it works better, it meets the mission better, it's more effective, it's faster, all that kind of stuff. So what that's evolved into is we have a team of 12 former contracting officers, lots of different backgrounds, DoD, civilian agencies, you name a type of contract, we've touched it. But the basic premise is all of us have been on both sides. We understand what it feels like to be a contractor and what it feels like to be a contracting officer. And so our mission is to bring context to both sides of GovCon. That's the reason we exist, is to close that gap and help people understand what the other side is thinking. And I'm happy to talk through all the different ways CMMC plays into that.
It certainly does. And I appreciate that. I never knew the background on the Skyway Bridge. I love that. I love the metaphor. You told me before we recorded, and in previous conversations, I've noticed this. You're very much a metaphor guy. So that very much fits with who you are. Okay, that's awesome. And to your point, I think there's a lot to touch on with CMMC. A lot of organizations within the defense industrial base are kind of having to come to grips with this for the first time, really, and starting to have to think about this in a little bit of a deeper way. And so a lot of the questions that I get as a C3PAO have to do with the actual process of when will it show up in my contracts? What does that actually mean? What's my interaction with the actual contract officer? How strict would they be? How much leniency would there be? So I'm really excited to dive into all this. So thank you again for joining. Before we dive into that, I think some really good context for everybody listening would be something that you schooled me on in some of our early conversations and some of your podcasts, which I'll plug. You do a fantastic job with your podcast. Is this concept of you have a triangle, the three deciders. I think there's a lot of maybe misconceptions around who's responsible for what in terms of the contract officer, different agencies, the actual contractor on the other end. Talk us through those three deciders, how they interlay, and kind of your overall philosophy as kind of a baseline for everybody listening.
Sure. So this is episode 118 of our podcast. And for some context, with episode 521 comes out this week. So it's been a long time ago that we came up with this idea, but it's evolved over time. But the basic element is you have a triangle with three groups of deciders that are a part of every contract award. The first decider is the economic decider. They're the one that funds the acquisition. Like they decide if anything is going to happen, if there will be funding. The second decider is the customer. That's the user. That's the one who needs the network to work. Whether they're buying body armor or weapons or IT support or janitorial services, there's a decider who says, I need the floor to be clean. I need the network to be secure, etc. That's the second decider. The third decider is the contracting officer. They decide how the item will be bought with the funding from the economic decider. So when you look at them as a triangle, the economic decider decides if something will be bought. The customer, who has the actual need, they're the one who decides what is going to be bought because it's their thing they're going to use. They write the requirement. And then the contracting officer is the one that has the authority as an appointed contracting officer to take the money from the economic decider and buy things for the customer with it. So the reason all three are important is that the economic decider decides if something's going to be bought. So the contracting officer doesn't have any money. The economic decider does. The contracting officer doesn't have a requirement. The customer does. What the contracting officer has is the ability, again, to take the money from the economic decider and buy what the customer needs. So the challenge is folks will find the contracting officer's name on sam.gov or someplace because they tend to be the most visible, and they'll send them all their information, but they don't have any money. They don't have a requirement. And so, and this topic today is a perfect example. The CMMC requirement is actually just, I'm gonna show off here. The document that I'm looking through here is the Undersecretary of Defense, actually it's the Office of Secretary of Defense document from 2025, early 2025. And in the attachment 1, and I like to give references because this isn't Kevin's opinion. I like to give people context. The cybersecurity maturity model certification level determinations and attachment. Read the whole thing, right? But paragraph 4 says, contracting officers will rely on information provided by the requiring activity to communicate the applicable CMMC level. Let me translate that. The contracting officer doesn't decide what the CMMC level is. They get it from the customer. And that's why it's so important that you know who your customer is, that you have a relationship with them, that you understand what their needs are, that you understand what level might they want. Because the contracting officer, to give you some context, if I don't know which level to go with, I'm a human, I'm going to protect myself, I'm going to go the highest level possible. That may not be needed, number one. That definitely probably isn't going to be what you need as the person trying to sell to the agency. So be aware that you don't necessarily want the contracting officer picking that level because A, they're not qualified for it, and B, if you force them into a corner of you must pick something, I'm going to pick the one that protects me the most, which is going to be the highest.
Yeah.
So that's how a basic way of how the three deciders play into this.
That's great. And I think if nothing else, maybe a big takeaway from this podcast would be for those that interact with contract officers, the contractors, maybe to not be so harsh on the contractors or to go at them. Apparently, they try to sell directly to them in some cases, which is very funny to hear. Reaching out to them and saying, hey, here's our service. You want to buy it? The contract officer's like, I'm not the buyer. What are you talking about? Okay, so I think that's a great segue. Starting to move into CMMC. So just to kind of lay the foundation for anybody listening. So as of the time of this recording, so 32 is CFR, the one that finalized the actual CMMC program, has been in place for almost a year now. At the end of December 2024 is when that became effective. And so the CMMC program as a whole has been in place. C3PAOs like A-LIGN, for instance, have been performing assessments on level 2 to perform or to grant level 2 certifications to organizations that will have that requirement. The second rule, which is more of what we're going to dive into here today, what's referred to often as the 48 CFR rule, because that's where it shows up in the Code of Federal Regulations. That one just recently reached the milestone of going to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which kind of tells us a little bit more about what timeline is likely. It doesn't define anything necessarily, but if I were to pull out my crystal ball, I would say, a lot of people in the industry are thinking October, November-ish timeframe is when that be finalized, effective. What does that one actually do? That one actually says, okay, the CMMC program is in place. 48 CFR has more language around the enforceability into DoD's contract requirements. And so one thing I'll get out of the way is one thing that we have seen for a while now is that's in the DoD's contract requirements. Prime contractors can and have been going to their subs and having different conversations and different levels of requirements, right? Because they know eventually they have flow down requirements. Once it does show up in the DoD's contract requirements, they have to flow down what will be DFAR 7021 into their contracts with their subcontractors. So they've been going to their entire supply chain, telling them some degree of, hey, this is coming, you need to be ready, right? But 48 CFR is around the corner. That is going to begin the phased rollout of the CMMC into DoD's contract requirements. And so one thing that I think is especially interesting, and Kevin, I've picked your brain on this once before, I'm curious to dive into it a little bit more detail on this call, is some of the language in there around that phased rollout. So phase 1 is outlined as the first 12 months. It mentions, hey, DoD at a minimum is going to require level 1 and level 2 self-attestations which is a big distinction. Organizations may not have to go get a third-party audit in that first year. But then they throw in this very fun, confusing sentence right after that that says, and I'll read verbatim, the DoD has discretion for requiring a level 2 C3PAO, which means you have to get a C3PAO assessment, a certification, instead of self-attestation within that first 12 months. So from your perspective, from a contract officer's perspective, but then just being in that space for a while, how do you generally see these things go when you see verbiage that is as vague as discretion, at their discretion? What might that mean?
So, no, it's just what it sounds like. Is it's a judgment call. And this is a particularly interesting time for that, because the FAR allows for a lot of judgment calls. The Federal Acquisition Regulations don't sound like they have a whole lot of space, white space for decisions, but they actually do. And they're getting more. If you're aware of the FAR overhaul that's happening right now, it's opening up a lot more white space for not just contracting officers, particularly for contracting officers, but also for program managers, customers, et cetera, to have more discretion. This fits right into that. Where, okay, well, what's the discretion based on? I would say it's going to be based on, first of all, the person I'm going to ask, the contracting officer is not going to make that decision in a vacuum, or at least they shouldn't. They're going to ask the customer. The customer is probably also going to ask contractors. Because if this is such a stringent requirement, if the 5 companies they think are going to bid, none of them have gotten a certification or got an assessment, then the risk is they may not have anybody bid. They might, but they wouldn't have the companies that they want to have bid. So there's a lot of communication going on here. That being said, this is also a shaping exercise. Whereas a contractor, if you've gotten the assessment and there's 3 companies that have gotten the assessment and the government is not in the business of getting hundreds of bids. As a contracting officer, my perfect number is 3. If I can get 3 really good bids and base my decision, you hear me thinking, often price alone, but it's usually not a price. The deciding factor and the final factor usually is price. But the other factors like how well are you going to actually do this? Will you show up on time? Will you get it done on schedule, et cetera? And by the way, how much it will cost. I can get all that from 3. So if there's 3 companies who have come to our small business office or come to that customer, the government customer, and said, hey, we've already gotten the assessment, they may go to the contracting officer and say, okay, this is a big enough deal. I know 3 companies have already gotten assessed. Let's put the requirement in there because our discretion says we can do that. And they may be getting a nudge from their CIO saying the sooner we can get this involved, the better. Because again, the purpose of this is to protect the government's data. So the CIO of that whatever government agency, they want it like yesterday. So any way they can convince the customer, the government user, to convince the contracting officer to put it in there, that's good for them. So this goes back to the eternal question of, well, is this a competitive advantage for you to have it? Absolutely. And it may even, over the longer this goes, the more of a competitive advantage it will be. Until everybody has it, then it's the standard. But now is your window. And so I get that question a lot of like, well, is this a competitive advantage? It's kind of like AI is knowing how to use AI is a competitive advantage now. It's like email was a competitive advantage 10 years ago. If you could do email marketing 20 years ago, you were ahead of the game. Now, everybody does it. We're annoyed by how much we get, right? AI is in the same cycle. 5 years from now, AI is going to be the standard, won't be a competitive advantage anymore. This is in the same place. The longer you wait, the more you erode your competitive advantage because it's going to be required. It's going to be table stakes for everybody. And now you're behind. So the best way to manage this as a contracting officer, going back to that discretion question, if we know that there are companies that can do this at our discretion, what's the path of least resistance for us is to shrink the number of offers. And yes, we're going to get people that are going to complain because, well, you didn't give us enough time or you didn't give us the opportunity to bid. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to get my job. I'm a human. I'm trying to get my job done. My job is to award a contract to meet my customer's mission. If I can get 3 companies to bid, it'll meet that. So my discretion will be leaning toward putting it in there once I get those 3.
That's a really interesting perspective because something that I hear a lot, understandably, when you start to look at the numbers, if you're in this industry, you start to say, hey, the DoD estimates there's going to be around 80,000 organizations that are going to need a level 2 certification. You look at the beginning sort of rollout of CMMC as a program and the certifications that are happening. We just had the recent July town hall as of the recording of this with the Cyber AB, and they put out, it's north of 200 now, organizations that are certified. But if you do some quick math, 200 out of 80,000, that's not a lot, right? So a lot of people will push back and say, hey, this won't even roll out. This won't even be required because there's not going to be enough people to actually do it. So I think it's really interesting your perspective from a contract officer to say, hey, it's more of a conversation. It's more of a looking at, if I can find 3 bids, I'm good, right? Other people may complain, but that really speaks to this moat that you can create between you and your competitors that can be pretty massive. If you're taking this seriously early on and you can bid on work that they just cannot bid on it. I think that creates a huge competitive advantage. And so I really love the perspective from your end of basically saying like, hey, nothing's going to change. Like it's going to be a requirement. And so I just need to do my job to get the bids that I need. And then we're good because the requirement's not going to change, right?
And the other side of this, let's say that 10 companies come in and say, well, we don't have the certification yet. This isn't fair. And they make the argument there's only one company that has it. The pendulum may swing the other way and you don't have it in there for now. It's like, it's only going to happen a couple of times. It's kind of like when you have a requirement that's not commercial. Eventually, most things the government buys become commercial. And so that argument of we're the only ones that make this, that's only true for so long. So if your whole strategy is if I can just convince the government not to get safer in their cybersecurity, I'll keep winning. Listen to how that sounds. It's a flawed strategy to think, well, I'll just wait. And the thing that goes through my head is it's better to be a year early than 5 minutes too late on this. Because to your point, even if there's only 200 companies that need it, okay, I'll use again, like metaphors, the real ID. If you got your real ID, by the way, the requirement for real ID started after 9/11. So like 20 years ago, they started talking about improving the IDs. And so probably 10 years ago when they first started rolling them out, 5 years ago when I got my license renewed, it just showed up. Let's get my license renewed anyway. So that was easy, right? Now, try to get your real ID and there's lines out the BMV and you wait forever. And you can still get on the airplanes if you've got your real ID, but it's a hassle. That's the same metaphor here. It's like you can still get contracts probably 6 months, maybe even a year from now, but you have to convince the government not to require an assessment. You also have to hope that there's other companies that are like you that don't have the assessment. And frankly, you have to hope that the government is not, maybe they got hacked last month. Maybe the person who's deciding personally got, their identity stolen. And they're like, you know what? I don't want to deal with this because the risk of things going sideways is going to come back on me. And you can hear my voice, getting louder and talking faster because as a contracting officer, your name's on that contract forever. You can look up files that I was a contracting officer 15 years ago. My name doesn't come off of there. So if one of those contracts has a cybersecurity breach and my name's on it, I'm going to end up in Politico. True story. It wasn't about cybersecurity, but I actually got on Politico once because of something I put in the contract. That feeling is enough to motivate me to go, there's 3 companies that are already assessed. Let's go with them. It's a path of least resistance. Because again, at the end of the day, these are humans awarding contracts, not because they're lazy, not because they're trying to make this hard for you. They're trying to get their job done like the rest of us. And the path of least resistance is to have companies that are going to be the least risk to award to. And the DoD has vehemently stated the least risk is somebody who's had an assessment.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, that's great. Also, to your point, I mean, what you mentioned before of like, who knows what that individual person that has that discretion has had going on that may sway. That's what's so hard about the word like discretion. It's exactly that. There's white space. And, I think there's a funny analogy of like, you never know, you don't want to make a decision based on like what they had for lunch that day, right? Like that's how open-ended this could possibly be. I'm very curious to see how this initial phase 1 rollout goes. And then just to clarify for anybody listening, as phase 2, 3, 4 continue to roll out, it's going to then come as, okay, certification requirements, level 3 requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So really what we're talking about here is kind of this short little runway of the first 12 months that was intended for that. But then again, there is this discretion piece of certifications can be required within that first 12 months. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Any other thoughts that you have, I guess, as you've read some of the verbiage around CMMC, the rollout of it, to your point, the document or the memo from the DoD around, hey, when do you require what level to what contract and what is that based off of? Any other thoughts that you have based on any of that from your perspective as a contract officer?
So one of the big fears that I was getting early in when CMMC was coming out is that it applies. People will say it applies to every contract. Okay, that statement freaks people out. And the reason that's a bad thing is we don't want companies not even considering working with the government because they're like, wait a minute, I got to spend $50,000 just to play. Like that just doesn't sound fair. And to some extent, that's somewhat true. mean, I could make the argument that we all have to have cybersecurity. We all have to have cyber insurance. Like there are expenses in business that didn't exist 10 years ago, and this is just one of them. And it's a big one, but that'd be where this is going. So you have the time to work through it. But the reason that's a big deal is that make people understand that it doesn't apply to every contractor. As you said, it's only what do we say, like 80,000 out of the 600,000 companies that are actually registered in SAM. If you sell something that's commercial off the shelf, and if it's a small purchase item, like I get this question a lot, but if you're a small business that sells a product to military members who come in to your store and they use a government purchase card, that's not what this is for. This is for if you're transferring data back and forth. So the groundswell of fear is around the idea that like, oh, these companies aren't going out of business because they have to have this. No, if you're interacting with the government, if you're using things that require cybersecurity protection, then worry about it. But the last thing I'll point out is that the concept is not new. And I like FAR references, right? So FAR 1901 is a definition of federal contract information. And right there, it says to you, like, this is the stuff that the government's worried about. And that's in the FAR. It's not in the DFARS. That's not even CMMC specific. It's like this idea of we want the government protecting information that's going back and forth on our contracts. So familiarize yourself with that part of the FAR. Then you can get into, what the CUI is, the control but unclassified information. There's 126 categories estimated. I counted on my hand of CUI, of categories of CUI stuff. It's a lot of stuff, so it can get overwhelming. But just to give you some context, you have the time to work through this. And from a business model perspective, one of the things that I really like about the way the FAR in these language is written is that it allows for the contracting officer to say, we can limit it to contract award, can also limit it to contract option. So what that means is that we'll give you the base award, and to get the option a year from now, you have to have gotten your assessment. Well, again, put on your business owner hat, and that tells you, oh, I've got the contract. They'll renew my option if I get this done. Okay, now you can go to a bank and get a loan for the 50 grand because you have the business case to say they're going to give me the next year of work if I get this done. So you got to be creative with how this is managed. But I just want to make sure folks understand this doesn't apply everywhere all the time, and there is some time behind it. But it's like the real ID. The longer you wait to get it, more of a hassle it's going to be to get on the airplane. So
definitely. Any last things that you would want to say to anybody in the defense industrial base that may interact with a contract officer, maybe as a former contract officer, to let them know, I don't know, maybe to go a little bit easier on the actual contract officer in terms of the requirements themselves? Any guidance that you would give to anybody that may be interacting with a contract officer when CMMC is placed into that requirement?
Let's see, a couple of things. I'd say the first thing is that they didn't pick the regulation. I oversimplify this, but a lot of times contracting officers can feel like they're like cops. It's like, we didn't write the laws, we're just executing the laws, right? And so being frustrated with them doesn't help because, again, they're frustrated with it too, because it does make it harder for them to do their work. But just let them know, we're working on this. We have a plan for this. We plan to get this in the next year. Preempt that conversation. Let them know, for example, if you want to go after a contract that you don't have your assessment yet, but you're working on it, tell them that. Because then they can put in their market research and say, okay, I realize you're going to send me a proposal. I know that you're working on it. You'll have it by the next option. That's what shaping, that's what influencing an opportunity is. Now they can set up the evaluation criteria. They can go talk to the customer and say, would having a company that has the assessment by next year be okay with you? Again, 3 deciders, right? The customer is one of those deciders that says, yes, I can live with this for a year. The CIO says, yes, they're working on it. And then now they change the evaluation criteria to say you have to have it by option exercise. That doesn't happen without a conversation. And that conversation doesn't happen if we get this affront of like, why do I have to do this? This isn't fair. Well, the FAR's got lots of stuff that's not fair for one group, but it's great for other groups. That they can't get around that.
Yeah.
The last, and I got like so many things to talk about here. One of the things that I do want to point out to folks is this, as I read it as a contracting officer, this does apply to OTAs as well. In fact, in that regulation, it's page 2, paragraph 2 of that OSD memo specifically says, if this is a non-FAR based concept, it still applies. So there's a lot of, this clause isn't in my contract. This is designed if another transaction, in other words, a non-FAR based contract, which a lot of the DoD is doing a lot of those now. be aware that it is likely to apply to you soon. It will apply to you eventually because you're trading back cyber information. So it's one of the other big questions I get. It's like, well, when doesn't it apply? It really only doesn't apply on the small stuff and micro purchases and when it's a commercial off the shelf. Other than that, you got to be ready.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much. This has been super insightful. I learn a lot every time I chat with you, particularly about the contract officer's perspective. And I think that's why I wanted you to have the opportunity to come on here and kind of relate to anybody that might be interested in better understanding like where they actually sit in this. What are they responsible for? What are they not responsible for? And so hopefully this opens up some new conversations, like you said, between the bidders and the actual contract officer. I would say sometimes like I get pushback from clients if I say, hey, just go have this conversation with them. They don't want to necessarily proactively bring it up sometimes, right? They might be a little bit scared. They're like, oh, I don't necessarily want to mention it to them. Is there anything that you would say in terms of like that point of like, hey, just have this conversation with them? Sometimes they'll be like, well, I don't want to proactively mention it and then put it into their head. To that, I would say, hey, they know that the requirement's coming regardless. You're not going to put it in their head preemptively. But is there anything you would say to somebody who would say, okay, I know you say go have this conversation of I'm going to get certified in a year, but like I don't necessarily want to start that and maybe, preempt some of this requirement that is a little bit down the road?
I'll say two things to that. One, what if your competitor is? Like that tells you you're behind, right? And second is your point you just made that I can't imagine they don't know that it's coming. I mean, the contract officers are getting the same information that we are as far as how to actually put this in place, and they're probably more stressed about it. And the fact that, and I would argue that one of the reasons I'd be concerned is if you didn't mention it. If you didn't at least mention we're working on our assessment. We plan to get our assessment by end of FY26. Like if you're not even mentioning it, and particularly if you're bidding on a contract, which these clauses have been in for some time, by the way, there's that. If you're bidding on a contract, it doesn't even mention the fact that we have a cybersecurity position. That we use encrypted pieces. We have two-factor authentication options. We have cybersecurity network. If you have some kind of explanation of what you do, and you're working on the assessment, the downside to me far outweighs the upside, because the idea, if you don't say something to them, they may think, well, they're not really ready for this contract. And then remember, if your competitor does bring it up, why didn't you bring it? Now you're at a disadvantage. So again, I'm trying to think of a better metaphor than the real ID, but that's kind of the best way to think of it. Is that the longer you wait for this, the less prepared you look. Like if you're a professional who works with government contracts and you have the ability to access information that the government wants to protect, and you're afraid of having the conversation about how you protect it, doesn't that sound kind of weird? That sounds right. Like, well, and I get it. The fear is, well, what if they go to the extreme and they go, oh, well, since you brought it up, we do want to make this level 3. Okay, right. That's 1% chance, because that's more work for them. Because again, they're a human. It's like they don't want to create work for themselves. They want the path of least resistance. And so the path of least resistance is going with companies that are lower risk. And so that's probably, I guess, as I verbally think through this while we're talking, the way that I would, if you're concerned about it, introduce it as a risk assessment tool. Because at the end of the day, government contracting officers, okay, I'm speaking for myself and all the folks on our team, we are focused, not maniacally, but pretty heavily on what is the lowest risk award strategy. Like the acquisition plan is based on what's most likely to actually get me the outcome that my customer wants. Because the purpose of a contract isn't to exist. The purpose of a contract is to solve a problem for a government user, the customer, right? And so if the contract that I'm awarding has the lowest risk, that's actually better. Well, one of the low risk strategies, particularly now, is we already have our assessment. We're getting it done. We're aware of this. Even if you said we're a small company, this is a small business set aside, we're saving up for it, or when we get our first award, we'll get a loan for it. Talk about the fact that you're aware of it. Because I would be, the more I think through this, I'd be more concerned that you're not mentioning it. Just because, dude, it's the second podcast this week I've done on this topic. I can't be the only one talking about this. So be aware that there's a momentum piece to this, and eventually by not it's kind of like it's almost like not having the SAMP certification. 10 years from now, this will be such a low level thing of you have to have this if you want the government to give you a contract. Sorry.
Right. Another analogy. We found another one. to your point, I think it's really interesting that, your name's on the contract forever. So talking about that low risk, I think it's always going to be something that the contract officers incentivize to go more towards, right? The lower risk situation, given that. Kevin, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you so much. Appreciate your insights. So I just want to say one last time, thank you so much for coming on, talking through this. Is there any last words of advice that you give before we wrap up?
Well, I'll give you my plug that if you're interested in learning more about what Skyway does, just go to Skyway ACQ. That's short for Skyway Acquisition. A good place to start is we also have a podcast. It's a private podcast that we create the content for our customers, and you can actually use a promo code. In fact, I'll make a promo code that A-LIGN. Here we go. We'll call it A-LIGN 2025. There you go. That'll be a promo code to get 10%.
There it is.
And the idea is that if you want to understand both sides of GovCon, that's what we do. And so about 30% of our listeners are government folks, government contracting officers, and the other 70 are contractors. And this type of stuff is what we're here to help people understand.
I love it. I love it. Glad you got to plug that. They do fantastic work. Podcast is great. So go check it out if you're interested in learning more. And Kevin, thank you again. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Matt. Have a good one.
All right. See you guys.